The year was 1882, and the American West stretched endlessly under a blazing sun that seemed to paint everything in shades of gold and copper. In the small frontier town of Mesquite Springs, Arizona Territory, the wooden buildings creaked under the relentless heat, and tumbleweeds danced down the main street like ghostly dancers performing for an audience of lizards and jackrabbits. Jake "Dusty" Morrison sat atop his faithful horse, Ranger, surveying the town from a ridge overlooking the valley. His weathered face, bronzed by years under the desert sun, bore the marks of a man who had seen both triumph and tragedy. At 28 years old, he was considered one of the finest cowboys in the territory, known for his skill with both rope and rifle, and his unwavering sense of justice. The cowboy's wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow over eyes the color of storm clouds, and his leather chaps bore the scars of countless encounters with thorny mesquite and prickly pear cacti. Around his waist hung a well-worn gun belt, holding 2 Colt .45 peacemakers that had served him faithfully through many dangerous encounters with rustlers, outlaws, and wild animals. Dusty had been riding the range for the Barty Ranch, one of the largest cattle operations in the Arizona Territory. The ranch covered nearly 50,000 acres of high desert country, where longhorn cattle grazed on sparse grass and hardy desert plants. Life on the frontier was hard, but it was the only life Dusty had ever known, and he wouldn't trade it for all the gold in California. As he guided Ranger down the rocky slope toward Mesquite Springs, Dusty thought about the telegram he'd received that morning from his old friend, Sheriff Tom Bradley. The message had been brief but urgent. "Need your help. Trouble brewing. Come quick." The town of Mesquite Springs had been established just 5 years earlier, in 1877, when prospectors discovered silver in the nearby mountains. Like many boomtowns of the era, it had grown rapidly from a collection of tents and crude shacks into a proper settlement with a main street, several businesses, a church, and even a small school. The population had swelled to nearly 800 souls, making it one of the more significant communities in the territory. As Dusty rode into town, he noticed the usual cast of characters that populated frontier settlements. Mexican vaqueros and colorful serapes sat outside the cantina, their enormous sombreros providing shade as they shared stories and sipped cool drinks. Chinese immigrants who had come west to work on the railroads and stayed to try their luck in the mines, hurried along the wooden sidewalks carrying supplies. Native Americans from the nearby Apache and Navajo tribes occasionally visited the town to trade handmade pottery, blankets, and jewelry for manufactured goods. The clip-clop of Rangers' hooves on the hard-packed dirt echoed between the buildings as they made their way toward the sheriff's office. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street, and the air shimmered with heat waves that made distant objects appear to dance and waver like mirages. Dusty tied Ranger to the hitching post outside the sheriff's office and pushed through the heavy wooden door. The interior was considerably cooler than the street, thanks to thick adobe walls that kept the heat at bay. Sheriff Bradley, a bear of a man with graying hair and kind eyes, looked up from his desk with obvious relief. "Dusty. Thank God you're here," Tom said, rising to shake his friend's hand. "We've got ourselves a real situation brewing." "What kind of trouble, Tom?" Dusty asked, removing his hat and running a hand through his sandy hair. The sheriff gestured toward a chair. "Sit down, partner. This is going to take some explaining." As Dusty settled into the chair, Tom poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot that had been simmering on a small wood stove in the corner. The coffee was strong and black, the way cowboys preferred it after long days on the range. "You remember the Blackwood Gang?" Tom asked. Dusty's expression darkened. The Blackwood Gang was one of the most notorious outlaw bands in the Southwest, led by a vicious man named Black Jack Blackwood. They had terrorized the territory for months, robbing banks, rustling cattle, and killing anyone who stood in their way. "Course I do," Dusty replied. "Thought they'd moved on to New Mexico after that business in Tucson." "They're back," Tom said grimly. "And they've got their sights set on something big right here in Mesquite Springs." The sheriff pulled out a crumpled piece of paper from his vest pocket and handed it to Dusty. It was a wanted poster bearing the face of Black Jack Blackwood, a cruel-looking man with dead eyes and a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. "Word is they're planning to rob the First National Bank," Tom continued. "But that's not the worst part. There's a new schoolteacher coming to town tomorrow on the afternoon stage. Miss Elizabeth Hartwell, fresh from Boston. She's the daughter of some big shot back east, and if Blackwood gets wind of her arrival—" Tom didn't need to finish the sentence. Dusty understood the implications immediately. A wealthy Eastern woman would be a perfect target for kidnapping and ransom, especially one traveling alone in unfamiliar territory. "What do you need me to do?" Dusty asked. "I need you to be her protection," Tom said. Unofficial-like, of course. Can't spare any of my deputies, and frankly, you're better than all of them put together when it comes to handling trouble. Dusty nodded slowly. He had never been one to back down from danger, especially when innocent lives were at stake. The code of the West demanded that a man protect those who couldn't protect themselves, particularly women and children. Tell me about this schoolteacher, he said. Tom consulted a letter on his desk. Miss Elizabeth Hartwell, age 24, educated at Radcliffe College in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Her father is some kind of railroad baron who's invested heavily in Western expansion. Apparently, she volunteered to come out here to help educate frontier children. The town council was over the moon when she accepted the position. As the two men discussed the details of Miss Hartwell's arrival and the threat posed by the Blackwood gang, neither of them could have imagined how dramatically their lives were about to change. The stage that would bring the Eastern Lady to Mesquite Springs would also bring with it a series of events that would test the courage, honor, and heart of everyone involved. Outside, the sun was beginning to set behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange, pink, and purple. The desert evening was approaching, bringing with it the cool relief that made life bearable in the harsh southwestern landscape. Soon, the coyotes would begin their haunting songs, and the mysterious sounds of the night would echo across the vast wilderness. But for now, two friends sat in the gathering twilight, planning how to protect an unknown woman from dangers she could scarcely imagine, while somewhere in the darkness beyond the town, a gang of ruthless outlaws prepared to strike. The morning sun was just beginning to peek over the eastern mountains when Dusty made his way to the staging company office. The Butterfield Overland Mail had established a route through Mesquite Springs 3 years earlier, connecting the town to the growing network of commerce and communication that was rapidly spreading across the American West. The stagecoach was a magnificent sight, a bright red Concord coach built by the Abbott Downing Company in New Hampshire. These coaches were marvels of engineering, designed specifically for the rough conditions of Western travel. The body was suspended on leather thoroughbraces that provided a relatively smooth ride over bumpy terrain, and the wheels were built to withstand the punishment of rocks, ruts, and river crossings. Dusty checked his pocket watch, a gift from his father before the old man had died in a mining accident 5 years earlier. The stage from Tucson was due to arrive at 2:30 in the afternoon, carrying mail, supplies, and one very important passenger. As he waited, Dusty reflected on what he knew about life in the East. He had been born and raised in Arizona Territory, and his only knowledge of places like Boston came from newspapers, dime novels, and stories told by travelers passing through. He imagined a world of cobblestone streets, gas lamps, fancy carriages, and ladies in elaborate dresses who had never seen a rattlesnake or heard the howl of a coyote. What kind of woman would leave such comfort and safety to come to a place like Mesquite Springs? The frontier was no place for the faint-hearted. The nearest doctor was in Tucson, a 2-day ride away. The Apache had been peaceful lately, but everyone remembered the uprising just a few years back when Geronimo had led his warriors on a campaign that had terrorized the entire Southwest. And then there were the everyday dangers, scorpions, rattlesnakes, flash floods, and the ever-present threat of outlaws. The sound of hoofbeats and jingling harness announced the arrival of the afternoon stage. Dusty watched as the 6-horse team thundered into town, their coats lathered with sweat and their nostrils flaring from the hard run across the desert. The driver, a grizzled veteran named Whip Johnson, hauled back on the reins and brought the coach to a stop in a cloud of dust. Mesquite Springs. Whip called out. End of the line for today. The first passengers to emerge were a traveling salesman hawking patent medicines and a Mexican rancher returning from business in Tucson. Then the door opened again and Dusty felt his breath catch in his throat. Miss Elizabeth Hartwell was nothing like he had expected. She was tall and graceful, with auburn hair that caught the sunlight like burnished copper. Her traveling dress was practical yet elegant, made of deep blue cotton that complemented her fair complexion. But it was her eyes that captured Dusty's attention. They were the color of emeralds, bright with intelligence and determination. What surprised him most, however, was that she didn't look like a pampered Eastern lady who would wilt at the first sign of hardship. There was something in the set of her shoulders, the confident way she stepped down from the coach, that suggested she was made of sterner stuff than he had imagined. Elizabeth looked around the dusty main street of Mesquite Springs with obvious curiosity rather than dismay. She seemed to be taking in every detail, the adobe buildings with their red tile roofs, the Mexican children playing in the street, the vaqueros lounging in the shade of the cantina's portal. Miss Hartwell? She turned at the sound of her name, and Dusty found himself looking into those remarkable green eyes. Up close, he could see that her face bore a light dusting of freckles across her nose and cheeks, giving her a wholesome, approachable appearance that was far removed from the porcelain doll beauty he had associated with Eastern ladies. "Yes, I'm Elizabeth Hartwell," she said, extending a gloved hand. Her voice carried just a trace of the cultured Boston accent he had expected, but it was warm and friendly rather than cold or superior. "I'm Jake Morrison," he said, removing his hat. "Most folks call me Dusty. Sheriff Bradley asked me to make sure you got settled in safely." Elizabeth smiled, and Dusty felt something shift inside his chest. It was a genuine smile, not the practiced social expression he had expected from someone of her background. "How very kind of you, Mr. Morrison," she said. "I must admit, after 3 days of stagecoach travel, I'm quite looking forward to sleeping in a real bed again." As Dusty helped gather her luggage, 2 substantial trunks and a leather valise, he found himself stealing glances at this fascinating woman. She had traveled alone from Boston to Arizona Territory, a journey that would have daunted many men. The Transcontinental Railroad had only been completed 13 years earlier, in 1869, and even with that marvel of engineering, the trip still required considerable courage and determination. "Have you been to the West before, Miss Hartwell?" he asked as they loaded her belongings onto a small wagon. "Please call me Elizabeth," she said. "And no, this is my first time west of the Mississippi River. It's quite different from what I expected." "Different how?" She paused, looking around again at the rugged landscape. "More beautiful," she said simply. "And more alive somehow. In Boston, everything is so controlled, so predictable. Here you can feel the wildness in the air." Dusty was surprised by her response. Most Eastern visitors complained about the heat, the dust, the primitive conditions. But Elizabeth seemed genuinely enchanted by what she saw. As they made their way through town toward the small house that had been prepared for the new schoolteacher, Elizabeth asked questions about everything: the local plants and animals, the history of the settlement, the mix of cultures that made up the population. "I understand there are children here from many different backgrounds," she said. "Mexican, Chinese, Native American?" "That's right," Dusty confirmed. "Mesquite Springs is what you might call a melting pot. Folks from all over the world have ended up here, chasing dreams of silver and a new life." Elizabeth nodded thoughtfully. "Then I'll need to learn some Spanish and perhaps some Apache and Chinese as well. I want all the children to feel welcome in my classroom." Her comment revealed something about her character that impressed Dusty greatly. Many people from the East viewed the diverse population of the frontier with suspicion or condescension, but Elizabeth seemed genuinely excited about the opportunity to work with children from different cultures. The teacher's house was a small but comfortable adobe structure near the schoolhouse, with thick walls that would keep it cool in summer and warm in winter. It had been furnished with basic necessities by the town council: a bed, a table and chairs, a wood-burning stove, and shelves for books. As Dusty helped carry her trunks inside, Elizabeth looked around with satisfaction. "It's perfect," she declared. "Much more charming than my stuffy apartment in Boston." "You'll want to check for scorpions before you put on your shoes each morning," Dusty advised. "And shake out your blankets before you go to bed. They like dark, quiet places." Instead of being horrified, Elizabeth seemed fascinated. "Scorpions? How extraordinary. Are they very dangerous?" "The little ones can give you a painful sting, but they won't kill you," Dusty explained. "It's the big rattlesnakes you need to watch out for. And in summer we get flash floods that can turn a dry creek bed into a raging river in minutes." Elizabeth listened intently to his warnings, asking intelligent questions and taking mental notes. Dusty realized that she was approaching the challenges of frontier life the same way she might have approached an academic subject, with curiosity, determination, and a methodical desire to understand. As the afternoon wore on, they were joined by several members of the town council, including the mayor, Dr. Samuel Prescott, and his wife, Martha. The Prescotts were originally from Ohio and had arrived in Mesquite Springs 2 years earlier when the doctor had decided to seek his fortune in the West. "Miss Hartwell," Dr. Prescott said warmly, "we can't tell you how delighted we are to have someone of your qualifications join our little community. The children have been so excited ever since we announced your arrival." Martha Prescott, a kindly woman in her 40s, had brought a basket of food: fresh bread, preserves, and a pot of stew. "I thought you might be tired of stagecoach food," she said with a motherly smile. As they shared an impromptu meal, Elizabeth learned more about her new home. Mesquite Springs had been growing steadily since the discovery of silver in the nearby Dragoon Mountains. The mines employed over 100 men, and their families had created a demand for all the services of civilization: stores, restaurants, a church, and most importantly, a school. "We've been getting by with a volunteer teacher," Dr. Prescott explained, but none of them have had formal training. When we heard that someone with your credentials was willing to come west, well, it seemed too good to be true. Elizabeth had graduated from Radcliffe College with honors, having studied literature, mathematics, history, and what was then called natural philosophy, the predecessor to modern science. She had also volunteered at settlement houses in Boston, working with immigrant children whose parents had come to America seeking a better life. As evening approached and the townspeople began to take their leave, Dusty lingered behind. He wanted to make sure Elizabeth understood the potential dangers she faced, but he also found himself reluctant to leave her company. "There's something else you should know," he said quietly after the others had gone. "Sheriff Bradley didn't want to worry the town council, but there's been word that the Blackwood gang might be heading this way." Elizabeth's expression grew serious. "The Blackwood gang?" Dusty showed her the wanted poster. "They're a bad bunch, robbers and killers who've been terrorizing the territory for months. The sheriff thinks they might try to rob the bank here in town and—" He hesitated, not wanting to frighten her on her first night in her new home. "And what?" she prompted. "Well, a lady like you from a wealthy Eastern family might be seen as a tempting target for kidnapping," he said reluctantly. Instead of becoming frightened, Elizabeth studied the wanted poster with the same analytical attention she had given to everything else. "This Black Jack Blackwood looks like a thoroughly unpleasant character," she observed. "What are you and the sheriff planning to do about it?" Her calm reaction surprised him. "We're going to be keeping a close eye on things," he said. "And I'll be staying close to town for a while just in case." Elizabeth looked at him directly, and he saw something in her eyes that he hadn't expected, not fear but determination. "Mr. Morrison Dusty," she said, "I want you to know that I didn't come to Arizona to hide behind other people's courage. If there's danger coming to this town, I want to help face it, not cower in my house waiting for other people to protect me." At that moment, as the desert sunset painted the sky in brilliant colors and the first stars began to appear in the vast western sky, Dusty realized that Miss Elizabeth Hartwell was unlike any woman he had ever met. She had traveled 2,000 miles from everything familiar and comfortable, not to seek safety or luxury, but to make a difference in the lives of frontier children. She faced the prospect of danger with courage rather than hysteria. And despite having known her for only a few hours, he was already beginning to fall in love with her. 3 days after Elizabeth's arrival in Mesquite Springs, the school opened for the autumn term. Dusty found excuses to ride past the schoolhouse several times that morning, telling himself he was just keeping an eye on things for the sheriff, but secretly hoping to catch a glimpse of Elizabeth in her new role as teacher. The schoolhouse was a simple but sturdy building constructed of adobe bricks, with large windows that let in plenty of natural light. Inside, wooden desks arranged in neat rows faced a blackboard mounted on the front wall. Maps of the United States and the Arizona Territory hung beside the blackboard, along with pictures of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. When Dusty finally worked up the courage to dismount and peer through one of the windows, what he saw made him smile. Elizabeth stood at the front of the classroom, addressing a group of about 20 children ranging in age from 6 to 14. What struck him most was the diversity of her students. Mexican-American children sat beside the sons and daughters of Anglo settlers, while 2 Chinese children shared a desk with an Apache girl whose father worked as a scout for the army. "Good morning, students," Elizabeth was saying in her clear, musical voice. "My name is Miss Hartwell, and I've come all the way from Boston, Massachusetts, to be your teacher. Now, I know that Boston is very different from Mesquite Springs, but I believe we can learn wonderful things from each other." She had written several words on the blackboard in both English and Spanish: welcome, learning, friendship, and respect. As she pointed to each word, she pronounced it in both languages, encouraging the children to repeat after her. "Bienvenidos," the Mexican children called out enthusiastically. "That's excellent," Elizabeth said with a warm smile. "Now, who can teach me how to say welcome in Chinese?" A shy boy of about 10 raised his hand tentatively. "Welcome," he said quietly. "Welcome," Elizabeth repeated, her pronunciation imperfect but earnest. "Thank you, Tommy. And can anyone teach me the Apache word for welcome?" The Apache girl, who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, stood up proudly. "Nizanigo," she said. As Dusty watched Elizabeth work with the children, he was struck by her natural ability to connect with them. She had a gift for making each child feel important and valued, regardless of their background or the language they spoke at home. It was clear that she genuinely cared about their education and their futures. After the morning lessons, Elizabeth dismissed the children for lunch, and many of them ran outside to play in the schoolyard. Dusty approached the building, still feeling somewhat awkward about his obvious interest in the new teacher. "Good morning, Dusty," Elizabeth called out, having spotted him through the window. She emerged from the schoolhouse, carrying a small basket that contained her own lunch. "Have you been checking up on me?" He felt his cheeks redden beneath his tan. "Just making sure everything's going smoothly," he said. "How was your first morning?" "Wonderful." Elizabeth's eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. These children are so eager to learn. Some of them walk miles to get here, and they arrive each morning ready to absorb everything I can teach them. She gestured toward a group of children who were playing a game that seemed to combine elements of tag and hide-and-seek among the mesquite trees behind the school. "Little Maria there, her father is a silver miner, and she dreams of becoming a nurse someday. And Carlos wants to be an engineer and help build railroads across the West." Elizabeth's passion for her work was evident in every word she spoke. Dusty found himself drawn not just to her beauty, but to the fire in her spirit, the way she saw potential in every child and possibility in every challenge. "Would you like to share lunch with me?" she asked. Martha Prescott packed enough food for 3 people, and I'd enjoy the company. They found a shady spot beneath a large Palo Verde tree, its green bark and delicate yellow flowers providing relief from the intense midday sun. Elizabeth spread a checkered cloth on the ground and unpacked sandwiches, fruit, and a jug of cool water. "Tell me about your life out here," she said as they ate. "Have you always been a cowboy?" Dusty found himself talking more freely than he had in years. He told her about growing up on a small ranch with his parents, about learning to ride and rope from his father, about the tragedy that had claimed both his parents and left him on his own at the age of 23. "After Pa died in the mine accident and Ma passed from grief the following winter," he said, "I hired on with the Barty Ranch. Old Tom Brennan, the owner, has been like a father to me these past 5 years. The work is hard, but there's something about the freedom of the range, the honesty of working with your hands and living by your wits, that suits me." Elizabeth listened intently, occasionally asking questions that showed she was really trying to understand this world that was so different from her own upbringing. "What about you?" Dusty asked. "What made a lady from Boston decide to come all the way out here to teach school?" Elizabeth was quiet for a moment, looking out at the desert landscape shimmering in the heat. "I suppose I was tired of the expectations that went with being a proper Boston lady," she said finally. "My father wanted me to marry some banker's son and spend my life hosting tea parties and charity balls. Not that there's anything wrong with charity work," she added quickly, "but I wanted to do something more meaningful, I suppose." She told him about her volunteer work in the settlement houses of Boston, helping immigrant children learn English and basic skills. "Those children reminded me why I became interested in teaching in the first place," she said. "They were so hungry to learn, so eager to make something of themselves in this new country. When I heard about the opportunity in Mesquite Springs, it seemed like a chance to really make a difference." "And your family was all right with you coming out here alone?" Dusty asked. Elizabeth laughed, but there was a note of sadness in it. "My father was furious. He said I was throwing away everything he'd worked to give me, that I was being selfish and irresponsible. We had quite a row before I left." "Do you miss it? Boston, and your family?" "I miss my father despite our disagreement," she admitted. "And I miss my younger sister, Catherine. But I don't miss the suffocating expectations, the sense that my whole life had been planned out for me before I was even born." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of running hoofbeats approaching the school. Dusty was instantly alert, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. A lone rider was approaching at a gallop, and as he drew closer, Dusty recognized one of Sheriff Bradley's deputies. "Miss Hartwell." "Dusty." Deputy Jim Walsh called out as he reined in his lathered horse. "Sheriff Bradley wants to see you both right away. Says it's urgent." Dusty helped Elizabeth gather their lunch things, and together they hurried toward town. Elizabeth had to practically run to keep up with Dusty's long strides, but she didn't complain. The urgency in the deputy's voice had been unmistakable. They found Sheriff Bradley pacing back and forth in his office, his usually calm demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. On his desk lay a piece of paper that looked like it had been delivered recently. "What's the trouble, Tom?" Dusty asked. The sheriff handed him the paper. It was a crudely written note that made Dusty's blood run cold. "Sheriff Bradley, we know about the new schoolmarm from back east. Her daddy's got plenty of money, and we figure he'd pay handsomely to get his little girl back safe and sound. You got until sunset tomorrow to put $5,000 in gold on the boulder at Devil's Canyon, or we take her. Don't try anything heroic, or she'll end up like that bank teller in Tucson. BJB." Elizabeth read the note over Dusty's shoulder, and he felt her stiffen beside him. The reference to the bank teller in Tucson was particularly ominous. Black Jack Blackwood had killed the man in cold blood during a robbery 3 months earlier, shooting him down even though he had offered no resistance. How did they know she was here? Dusty asked grimly. Word travels fast in small towns, Tom replied. Could have been anyone, a customer at the general store, someone at the saloon, maybe even one of the stagecoach passengers spread the news. Elizabeth had been listening to their conversation with growing indignation. So this Blackwood character thinks he can simply kidnap me and hold me for ransom? She said, her green eyes flashing with anger. Well, he's got another think coming. Miss Hartwell, Tom said gently, I know you're upset, but this isn't a game. Black Jack Blackwood has killed at least 6 people that we know of. He's not the kind of man to make idle threats. Then what do you propose we do? Elizabeth asked. Dusty was already formulating a plan. We're not going to let them take you, he said firmly. And we're not going to pay their ransom either. But we need to be smart about this. He turned to Sheriff Bradley. How many men can we count on? My 2 deputies, plus maybe 4 or 5 townsmen who can handle themselves in a fight, Tom replied. Problem is, we don't know how many men Blackwood has with him, or where they're holed up. I might be able to help with that, Dusty said. I know this country better than most, and I've got some Apache friends who could do some scouting for us. As the 3 of them discussed their options, none of them noticed the figure watching from across the street. Dressed like a drifter, with a battered hat pulled low over his eyes, he had been listening to their conversation through the open window. After a few minutes, he slipped away into the shadows between the buildings and headed for the edge of town, where a horse waited hidden among the mesquite trees. The trap was about to be sprung, but the question remained, who would be the hunter and who would be the prey? As darkness fell over Mesquite Springs, Dusty made his way to Elizabeth's house with his rifle and a bedroll. He had convinced Sheriff Bradley to let him stand guard rather than posting one of the deputies, arguing that his knowledge of the desert and his skills as a tracker made him the best choice for protecting the schoolteacher. Elizabeth met him at the door, having changed from her teaching dress into more practical clothes, a simple skirt and blouse that would allow her to move freely if the need arose. I've been thinking about what you said earlier, she told him as he settled onto the front porch with his back against the wall, where he could watch the approaches to the house. About knowing some Apache who might help us. Dusty nodded. There's a man named Joseph Crowfeather who works as a scout for the army. He's also a friend of mine from way back. If anyone can track Blackwood's gang and find their hideout, it's Joseph. How did you come to know him? Elizabeth asked, settling into a chair beside him. The question brought back memories of one of the most important events in Dusty's life. It was about 4 years ago, he said. I was tracking some stolen cattle up in the Dragoons when I got caught in a flash flood. My horse went lame and I was stranded in a box canyon with no way out and no supplies. He paused, remembering the desperation he had felt as the water rose around him. Joseph found me 3 days later, half drowned and delirious from thirst. He pulled me out of there, shared his water and food, and got me back to civilization. Saved my life. And you've been friends ever since? More than friends, Dusty said. In Apache culture, when someone saves your life, they become your brother. Joseph taught me to read the desert the way Apache scouts do, to see signs that most white men would miss, to move quietly through country where every rock and bush might hide danger. Elizabeth was fascinated by this glimpse into Dusty's past and the complex relationships that existed on the frontier between different peoples. Will he help us? If he's in the area, yes, Dusty said. Joseph has no love for outlaws of any kind. They give all the Apache a bad name and make life harder for those who are trying to live in peace with the white settlers. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the desert night. Coyotes howled in the distance, their voices rising and falling in haunting harmonies. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called, and its cry was answered from across the valley. It's so different from Boston, Elizabeth murmured. There, the nights are full of human sounds, carriages on cobblestones, voices from the taverns, the whistle of trains. Here it's like listening to the voice of the earth itself. Dusty was struck by her poetic way of describing the desert. Most people from back east found the western nights either frightening or boringly empty, but Elizabeth seemed to appreciate the wild beauty of it all. Are you afraid? He asked. She considered the question seriously. Yes, I suppose I am. But not of the desert or even of this Blackwood fellow exactly. I'm afraid of being helpless, of having my choices taken away from me. Does that make sense? It made perfect sense to Dusty. The frontier demanded self-reliance and courage from everyone who chose to make their life there, regardless of their gender or background. Elizabeth had already shown that she possessed both qualities in abundance. As the night wore on, they talked about many things. Elizabeth told him about her studies at Radcliffe, her love of literature and learning, her dreams of making education available to children who might not otherwise have the opportunity. Dusty shared stories of life on the range, of cattle drives and roundups, of nights spent under stars that seemed close enough to reach up and touch. Gradually, their conversation turned more personal. Dusty found himself telling Elizabeth things he had never shared with anyone: his loneliness, his dreams of someday having a ranch of his own, his fear that he was becoming too set in his ways to ever find a woman who would want to share the hardships of frontier life. "I think you underestimate yourself," Elizabeth said softly. "Any woman would be lucky to have a man with your courage and integrity." The sincerity in her voice made Dusty's heart race. In the moonlight, her face was beautiful beyond description, and he found himself leaning closer to her. The moment was shattered by the sound of a horse approaching at a fast trot. Dusty was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, pushing Elizabeth behind him as he moved toward the edge of the porch. "Hello, the house," came a familiar voice from the darkness. Dusty relaxed slightly. "Joseph." A figure emerged from the shadows, leading a horse. Joseph Crowfeather was a man of medium height with the lean, wiry build of someone who spent most of his time in the outdoors. His face was weathered and angular, with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. He wore a mixture of traditional Apache and white man's clothing: buckskin leggings and moccasins, a cotton shirt, and a red bandana around his forehead. "My brother," Joseph said in English, though his accent carried the musical cadences of his native tongue. "I heard there was trouble in your town." Dusty stepped down from the porch to greet his friend with a firm handshake. "How did you know?" Joseph's weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. "Bad news travels faster than good news, especially when it concerns Blackjack Blackwood. That one has made enemies among my people as well as yours." Dusty introduced Elizabeth, and Joseph removed his hat respectfully. "Miss," he said with a slight bow, "I am sorry you have been caught up in this danger." "Mr. Crowfeather," Elizabeth said, standing and extending her hand. "Dusty tells me you're one of the finest scouts in the territory. I'm grateful for any help you can provide." Joseph shook her hand, clearly impressed by her directness and lack of fear. Many white women were uncomfortable around Apache, even those who worked with the army. "I have been tracking Blackwood's gang for 2 days, Joseph said, turning back to Dusty. "They are camped in the old mine workings about 15 miles northeast of here, in Skeleton Canyon. 6 men well armed, and they have been watching your town." Dusty felt a chill run down his spine. Skeleton Canyon was perfectly positioned for launching an attack on Mesquite Springs, with multiple escape routes through the rugged mountains. "How well do they know the country?" he asked. "Not as well as they think," Joseph replied. "Blackwood has been here before, but his men are from Texas and New Mexico. They do not understand desert warfare." As the three of them discussed the situation, a plan began to take shape. Joseph would continue to monitor the outlaw camp, while Dusty and the sheriff organized the town's defenses. But they all knew that their small force would be no match for Blackwood's gang in a direct confrontation. "We need to turn their plan against them," Dusty said thoughtfully. "They're expecting us to either pay the ransom or try to defend the town. What if we did neither?" Elizabeth looked at him with growing understanding. "You're suggesting we take the fight to them instead?" "It's risky," Dusty admitted. "But Joseph knows that country like the back of his hand, and surprise would be on our side." Joseph nodded slowly. "It could work, but it would require perfect timing and complete trust between all of us." As they refined their plan, Elizabeth made a suggestion that surprised both men. "What if I were to serve as bait?" she said. "If they're expecting to kidnap me, we could use that expectation to lure them into a trap." "Absolutely not," Dusty said immediately. "It's too dangerous." Elizabeth's green eyes flashed with determination. "Dusty Morrison, I didn't come out here to be protected like some fragile flower. These men are threatening innocent people in this town. If there's a way I can help stop them, then I'm going to do it." The argument that followed revealed the depth of feeling that had developed between Dusty and Elizabeth over the past few days. What had started as attraction and respect had deepened into something much more profound, and the thought of putting Elizabeth in danger was almost more than Dusty could bear. "I understand your concern," Elizabeth said finally, her voice gentling. "But please understand mine. I've spent my whole life having other people make decisions for me, telling me what I could and couldn't do because I was a woman. I won't live that way anymore." Joseph had been listening to their exchange with interest. In Apache culture, Women were respected as warriors and decision-makers, and he understood Elizabeth's desire to play an active role in her own protection. "The lady has courage," he said to Dusty. "And courage is the most important weapon in any fight. If she is willing to take the risk, perhaps we should listen to her plan." Elizabeth outlined her idea with the methodical precision of an educated woman accustomed to solving complex problems. She proposed to make herself visible around town the next day, following her normal routine but taking a path that would lead her close to the canyon where Blackwood's gang was camped. Meanwhile, Dusty and Joseph would position themselves along the escape routes, ready to spring their own trap when the outlaws made their move. "The key is timing," she explained. "They'll want to take me somewhere isolated, away from the town where people might interfere. If we can predict where they'll make their move, we can be waiting for them." Despite his misgivings, Dusty had to admit that Elizabeth's plan had merit. It would allow their small force to choose the time and place for the confrontation, rather than waiting helplessly for Blackwood to strike. "All right," he said reluctantly. "But we do this my way with safeguards and backup plans. And if anything goes wrong, you get out of there immediately." Elizabeth smiled and reached out to touch his hand. "Thank you for trusting me." As Joseph prepared to return to the desert to continue monitoring the outlaw camp, he pulled Dusty aside for a private word. "Your woman has the heart of a warrior," he said in his accented English. "But be careful, my brother. Blackwood is cunning as well as dangerous. He may not react as we expect." After Joseph disappeared back into the night as silently as he had come, Dusty and Elizabeth sat together on the porch, each lost in their own thoughts. The plan they had devised was sound, but they all knew that no plan survived contact with the enemy unchanged. "Dusty," Elizabeth said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you." He looked at her, seeing something in her expression that made his chest tighten. "If something happens tomorrow," she continued, "I want you to know that these past few days have been the happiest of my life. Coming here, meeting you, feeling truly free for the first time, it's been worth any risk." Dusty felt his resolve crumble. Reaching out, he took her hands in his, feeling how small and delicate they were despite the strength he knew lay within her. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I've been a fool to think that someone like you could ever care for someone like me. But if we get through this, if we both survive what's coming, I'd be honored if you'd let me court you proper." Instead of answering with words, Elizabeth leaned forward and kissed him softly. It was a gentle kiss, sweet and full of promise, and it sealed the bond that had been growing between them since the moment they met. When they finally parted, both of them knew that whatever happened in the coming confrontation, their lives had been forever changed by this moment under the desert stars. Dawn broke clear and hot over Mesquite Springs, with not a cloud in the brilliant blue sky. Dusty had spent the night on Elizabeth's porch, dozing fitfully while keeping watch for any sign of trouble. As the first rays of sunlight painted the adobe buildings in shades of gold and rose, he knew that this would be a day that would change everything. Elizabeth emerged from the house wearing her usual teaching dress, but Dusty noticed she had made some practical modifications. The skirt was slightly shorter than fashion dictated, allowing for easier movement, and she wore sturdy boots instead of delicate slippers. Most tellingly, she had pinned her hair up in a simple style that wouldn't obstruct her vision. "Ready?" she asked, though Dusty could see the tension in her shoulders despite her calm demeanor. "As ready as we'll ever be," he replied, checking his weapons one final time. In addition to his twin Colts, he carried a Winchester rifle and a knife. Hidden in various pockets were extra ammunition, matches, and a small supply of jerky and water. They made their way to the sheriff's office, where Tom Bradley was organizing the town's defenses. The plan they had developed called for most of the deputies and armed townsmen to remain in Mesquite Springs, both to protect the other residents and to serve as a visible deterrent. Only Dusty would accompany Elizabeth on her dangerous mission, with Joseph providing reconnaissance and backup from the desert. "You sure about this, Miss Hartwell?" Sheriff Bradley asked one final time. "It's not too late to change your mind." Elizabeth's green eyes were steady and determined. "I'm sure, Sheriff. These outlaws have terrorized this territory long enough. It's time someone stood up to them." As they prepared to leave, Dr. Prescott arrived with his medical bag. "In case anyone gets hurt," he explained, "I'll be waiting at the edge of town with a horse, ready to ride wherever I'm needed." The concern and support of the townspeople touched Elizabeth deeply. In just a few days she had become more than their schoolteacher. She had become one of them, a member of their community worth protecting and defending. Dusty and Elizabeth left town separately, with Elizabeth walking toward the school as she did every morning, while Dusty rode out on Ranger as if heading for the range. To any observer, It would appear to be a normal day in Mesquite Springs. But hidden eyes were watching from the hills above town, and those eyes belonged to men who had no interest in normal days or peaceful settlements. Blackjack Blackwood lowered his spyglass and turned to the 5 men who made up his gang. They were a rough bunch, hardened by years of violence and lawlessness. There was Miguel Santos, a former vaquero who had turned outlaw after killing a ranch foreman in a dispute over wages. Sidewinder, Pete Johnson was a gunfighter from Texas with a reputation for being fast on the draw and slow on mercy. The Kowalski brothers, Jan and Stanislav, were Polish immigrants who had found that robbing banks paid better than working in them. And finally there was Dead-Eye Davidson, a former buffalo hunter whose skill with a rifle was matched only by his cruelty toward his victims. "There she is," Blackwood said, his scarred face twisting into an ugly smile. "Pretty as a picture and walking right into our hands." "What about the cowboy?" Miguel asked, having spotted Dusty riding out of town. "He's been sniffing around her like a lovesick puppy." Blackwood spat into the dust. "Let him ride. By the time he figures out what's happened, we'll be long gone with our prize." What Blackwood didn't know was that Joseph Crowfeather was watching them from a concealed position less than 100 yards away. The Apache scout had positioned himself before dawn, moving through the desert terrain with the silent skill of his ancestors. Now he observed the outlaws through a small gap in the rocks, noting their positions, weapons, and apparent plan of attack. Down in the valley, Elizabeth followed her normal routine, walking from her house to the schoolhouse and preparing for the day's lessons. But instead of the usual 20 children, only a handful showed up. Their parents, warned by Sheriff Bradley, had kept them home for their own safety. "Miss Hartwell," asked little Maria Santos, the daughter of the Mexican miner, "why aren't the other children here today?" Elizabeth knelt down to the child's level, her heart aching at the innocence in the girl's dark eyes. "There might be some dangerous men in the area today, sweetheart. Your parents wanted to keep you safe at home. But you're here," Maria pointed out with 8-year-old logic. "Aren't you afraid of the dangerous men?" Elizabeth smiled and touched the child's cheek gently. "Sometimes we have to be brave even when we're afraid. That's what courage means." After sending the few students home to their families, Elizabeth began the most difficult part of her day. According to the plan, she needed to make herself visible and vulnerable, walking along the path that led toward Skeleton Canyon. Every instinct she had developed growing up in the civilized world told her this was madness, but her frontier spirit had awakened something stronger than fear. As she walked along the dusty trail, Elizabeth found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been living in a comfortable Boston mansion, her biggest worry being which dress to wear to the next social gathering. Now she was walking into possible danger to protect a town full of people who had become her friends and neighbors. The desert around her was alive with subtle beauty that she had learned to appreciate. Prickly pear cacti displayed bright yellow blooms, while ocotillo plants reached toward the sky like thorny fingers tipped with red flames. In the distance, the mountains rose in layers of purple and blue, their peaks still touched with the cool shadows of early morning. But Elizabeth's appreciation of the scenery was cut short by the thunder of hoofbeats approaching from behind. Turning, she saw 5 riders bearing down on her at a full gallop, dust clouds billowing behind their horses. This was it. The moment of truth had arrived. Elizabeth forced herself to appear surprised and frightened, stumbling backward as the riders surrounded her. Their leader, a man whose scarred face matched the description on the wanted posters, dismounted and approached her with a cruel smile. "Well, well," Blackjack Blackwood said, his voice like gravel over broken glass. "If it isn't the little schoolmarm from back east, your daddy's going to pay a pretty penny to get you back in one piece." "I don't know what you're talking about," Elizabeth said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm just out for a morning walk." Blackwood laughed, a harsh sound that made her skin crawl. "Don't play dumb with me, lady. We know exactly who you are and how much you're worth." Elizabeth Hartwell, daughter of railroad tycoon Jonathan Hartwell, graduate of that fancy college back in Massachusetts. The outlaw's knowledge of her background was disturbing, but Elizabeth forced herself to maintain her composure. "Even if that were true, my father would never pay ransom to criminals like you." "Oh, he'll pay," Blackwood said confidently. "Especially after we send him one of your pretty little fingers as proof we mean business." Before Elizabeth could react, rough hands grabbed her arms and began binding them behind her back. This was the part of the plan she had dreaded most, allowing herself to be captured, trusting that Dusty and Joseph would be able to rescue her before any real harm was done. As the outlaws prepared to take her away, Elizabeth caught a glimpse of movement in the rocks above the trail. For just a moment she saw the glint of sunlight on metal, A rifle barrel, perhaps, or the blade of a knife. Her heart leaped with hope, but she forced herself to show no sign that she had seen anything. "Put her on Sidewinder's horse," Blackwood ordered. "We'll take her up to the old mine and send word to her daddy. By this time tomorrow we'll be rich men." But as the outlaws mounted their horses with their captive, they had no idea that their every move was being watched by two of the deadliest men in the Arizona Territory. The trap was set, and soon the hunters would become the hunted. High above on a rocky ledge, Dusty Morrison checked his rifle one final time and prepared to do whatever it took to save the woman he loved. In the desert below, Joseph Crowfeather moved like a shadow between the mesquite trees, positioning himself for the ambush that would determine the fate of everyone involved. The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through the legends of the American West for generations to come. The old silver mine in Skeleton Canyon had been abandoned for 2 years, ever since the vein had played out and the mining company had moved their operations to more promising locations. What remained was a collection of weathered wooden buildings, rusted machinery, and dark tunnel openings that burrowed into the mountainside like the mouths of sleeping giants. It was the perfect hideout for outlaws, remote, defensible, and with multiple escape routes through the surrounding peaks and canyons. Black Jack Blackwood had used it as a base of operations several times before, and he felt confident that no lawman would be able to track them there. As the gang rode into the abandoned mining camp with their captive, Elizabeth took careful note of the layout. There was a main building that had served as the mine office and assay station, several smaller structures that had been bunkhouses and supply sheds, and the gaping entrance to the mine shaft itself. The whole complex was situated on a narrow shelf of land, with steep cliffs rising on 3 sides and only one practical approach from the desert floor below. "Home sweet home," Blackwood said with a harsh laugh as he dismounted. "Welcome to your new quarters, Miss Hartwell. I hope you'll find the accommodations to your liking." Elizabeth was roughly hauled down from the horse and marched toward the main building. Inside, the structure was surprisingly intact, with sturdy log walls and a stone fireplace that had provided warmth for countless miners during the harsh desert winters. The outlaws had obviously been using it as their headquarters, as evidenced by the bedrolls, supplies, and empty whiskey bottles scattered around the room. "Tie her up good and tight," Blackwood ordered his men. "I don't want any heroic escape attempts while we're negotiating with Daddy." As Sidewinder Pete and Miguel Santos bound her hands and feet with rough hemp rope, Elizabeth forced herself to remain calm and observant. She noted the positions of weapons, the number of guards, and most importantly, the various ways in and out of the building. "Now then, Miss Hartwell," Blackwood said, settling into a chair across from her, "let's discuss the terms of your release. Your father is worth at least $1 million by my reckoning. I think $50,000 in gold would be a fair price for his daughter's safe return." "You're deluding yourself if you think my father will negotiate with kidnappers," Elizabeth replied with more courage than she felt. "He's a proud man who doesn't bow to threats." Blackwood's scarred face darkened with anger. "Oh, he'll pay up all right. Especially after I send him a little token of our sincerity." The outlaw leader drew a wicked-looking knife from his belt and moved toward Elizabeth. "Which finger would you like to spare, Miss Hartwell? I'm feeling generous today." Before he could carry out his threat, one of the men standing guard outside called out urgently, "Boss, we got company coming up the trail." Blackwood cursed and moved to the window, peering down at the desert floor below. In the distance, a lone rider was approaching, moving slowly and openly as if he had nothing to hide. "Just one man," observed Deadeye Davidson, who had the best vision among the gang members. "Looks like a cowboy." "It's that Morrison fellow," Miguel said, recognizing Dusty even at a distance. "The one who's been sniffing around the schoolmarm." Blackwood considered this development. He had expected that someone would come looking for the missing teacher eventually, but he hadn't expected it to happen so quickly or with so little backup. "Could be a trap," suggested Jan Kowalski. "Could be," Blackwood agreed. "Or could be that lovesick fool thinks he can rescue his lady friend all by himself. Either way, we'll be ready for him." What Blackwood couldn't see from his vantage point was that Dusty's apparent approach was actually a carefully orchestrated diversion. While the outlaws focused their attention on the lone rider coming up the main trail, Joseph Crowfeather was scaling the cliff face on the opposite side of the canyon, moving with the silent skill of a mountain cat. The Apache scout had studied the layout of the mining camp for hours, identifying every possible approach and escape route. Now, as he pulled himself over the rim of the cliff and crept toward the back of the main building, he was invisible to the outlaws who were all watching Dusty's approach. Down on the desert floor, Dusty continued his steady advance, playing his part in the dangerous charade. He rode openly, his hands clearly visible and away from his weapons, giving every appearance of a man coming to negotiate rather than fight. When he was within shouting distance of the mining camp, Dusty reined in Ranger and called out, "Blackwood, I want to talk." The outlaw leader appeared in the doorway of the main building, his rifle trained on the lone cowboy. Well, if it isn't the knight in shining armor. Come to rescue your lady friend, have you?" "I've come to make a deal," Dusty replied, his voice carrying clearly in the thin desert air. "The lady for me. Straight trade." Blackwood laughed. "And why would I want to make that trade, cowboy? The lady's worth $50,000. What are you worth?" "I'm worth something to the territorial authorities," Dusty called back. "There's paper out on me for killing a man in Tombstone last year. Self-defense, but try telling that to his family. They've put up $1,000 reward." It was a complete lie, but Dusty delivered it with such conviction that even Blackwood seemed to consider it. The outlaw leader was always interested in making extra money with minimal effort. "Even so," Blackwood said after a moment, $1,000 isn't $50,000. You'll have to sweeten the pot." "I know where Tom Brennan keeps his ranch payroll," Dusty said. $20,000 in gold, hidden where nobody would think to look. Trade me for the lady, and I'll tell you exactly where to find it." This got Blackwood's attention immediately. The Barty Ranch was one of the largest operations in the territory, and a payroll of that size would be a tempting target for any outlaw gang. While this negotiation was taking place, Joseph had reached the back wall of the main building. Through a crack between the logs, he could see Elizabeth tied up inside, with 2 guards watching her while the other outlaws focused on Dusty. The Apache scout drew his knife and began working on the rope that secured one of the back wall's logs. The wood was old and weathered, and with careful pressure, he was able to create a gap large enough to slip through. "All right, cowboy," Blackwood called out. "Come on up, but keep your hands where I can see them. And remember, if you try anything heroic, your lady friend pays the price." Dusty dismounted and began walking up the narrow trail toward the mining camp, his hands raised but his eyes constantly moving, taking in every detail of the terrain and the positions of the outlaws. He could see rifle barrels protruding from windows and doorways, and he knew that any wrong move would result in a hail of bullets. As he approached the main building, Dusty caught a glimpse of movement through one of the back windows. For just an instant he saw Joseph's face, and the Apache scout gave him an almost imperceptible nod. The rescue was about to begin. Inside the building, Elizabeth had also seen Joseph's arrival, though she was careful not to let her guards notice her awareness. Her heart pounded with a mixture of hope and terror as she realized that the moment of truth was at hand. "That's close enough," Blackwood said when Dusty was about 20 feet from the doorway. "Now let's hear about this ranch payroll." "First, I want to see that Miss Hartwell is unharmed," Dusty replied. Blackwood gestured to one of his men, who dragged Elizabeth to the doorway where Dusty could see her. She looked frightened but unhurt, and their eyes met briefly across the dusty courtyard. "She's fine as you can see," Blackwood said. "Now about that gold." But before Dusty could respond, chaos erupted from multiple directions at once. Joseph burst through the back wall of the building, his knife flashing as he attacked Elizabeth's guards. At the same time, Dusty drew both his pistols with lightning speed, diving for cover behind an old mining cart as bullets began flying in all directions. The Battle of Skeleton Canyon had begun, and its outcome would determine not just the fate of Elizabeth and Dusty, but the future of law and order in the Arizona Territory. The abandoned mining camp erupted into a maelstrom of gunfire and shouts as the carefully laid trap finally sprung. Joseph Crowfeather moved through the back room of the main building like a vengeful spirit, his knife finding its mark with deadly precision. The first guard went down without a sound, while the second managed only a single startled cry before joining his companion on the floor. Outside, Dusty had taken cover behind the heavy iron ore cart, his twin Colts barking defiance as he traded shots with Blackwood's remaining men. The outlaws had the advantage of numbers and position, but Dusty had something more valuable, the desperate courage of a man fighting for the woman he loved. "Get the girl?" Blackwood shouted over the gunfire. "She's our ticket out of here." But Joseph had already cut Elizabeth's bonds, and she was far from helpless. Growing up with 2 brothers back in Massachusetts, she had learned to shoot during countless summer visits to their grandfather's farm in New Hampshire. Now, snatching up a fallen guard's pistol, she proved that Eastern ladies could be just as dangerous as frontier women when properly motivated. Miguel Santos, rushing into the building to recapture their prisoner, found himself facing not a helpless victim but an armed and determined woman. Elizabeth's first shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering across the wooden floor. "Madre de Dios," he gasped, clutching his wounded arm. "The señorita, she shoots like a man." "Better," Elizabeth replied grimly, keeping the gun trained on him. "I shoot like a woman with something to protect." Outside, the battle raged with the intensity of a summer thunderstorm. Sidewinder Pete had positioned himself behind the old assay building, his rifle spitting lead at Dusty's position. But the cowboy was no easy target. He moved from cover to cover with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to survive in hostile territory. Deadeye Davidson, true to his reputation, had found a sniper's perch atop the mine shaft housing and was methodically trying to pick off the interlopers. His shots came dangerously close to ending the fight before it had properly begun, forcing both Dusty and Joseph to keep constantly moving. The Kowalski brothers, meanwhile, had taken positions flanking the main building, trying to establish a crossfire that would trap their enemies. But they had underestimated the tactical skills of an Apache warrior who had learned warfare in the harsh school of desert survival. Joseph slipped out of the building through the gap he had created, moving like smoke between the abandoned structures. The Polish outlaws never saw him coming until it was too late. Jan Kowalski fell with Joseph's knife between his shoulder blades, while his brother Stanislav managed to get off one wild shot before joining him in death. "We're losing too many men," Sidewinder Pete shouted to Blackwood. "We need to get out of here." But Black Jack Blackwood was not a man to retreat easily, especially when his reputation was at stake. He had built his fearsome image on never backing down from a fight, and he wasn't about to start now. "Kill them all," he roared, drawing his own pistol. "No witnesses, no mercy." The outlaw leader stepped out from behind his cover, firing rapidly at Dusty's position. His shots were accurate, splintering the wooden sides of the ore cart and forcing the cowboy to keep his head down. But Blackwood had made a fatal error in judgment. By exposing himself in the open, he had given Dusty the target he had been waiting for. Rising from behind the cart with both guns blazing, the cowboy sent a hail of bullets toward the outlaw leader. Blackwood staggered, hit twice in the chest, but his legendary toughness kept him on his feet. Snarling like a wounded wolf, he continued advancing, determined to take his enemy with him into death. The two men faced each other across the dusty courtyard like gunfighters in a formal duel, though this was anything but a civilized encounter. This was the raw, brutal justice of the frontier, where right and wrong were decided by courage, skill, and determination. Dusty's first shot took Blackwood in the shoulder, spinning him halfway around but not dropping him. The outlaw's return fire missed by inches, the bullet whining past Dusty's ear like an angry hornet. Elizabeth, watching from the doorway of the main building, felt her heart stop as she saw the two men locked in their deadly dance. She raised her captured pistol, but the angle was wrong. She couldn't get a clear shot without risking hitting Dusty. "Please," she whispered, though she didn't know if she was praying to God or to the desert spirits that seemed to inhabit this wild land. "Please let him live." Blackwood's second shot was better aimed, catching Dusty in the left arm and nearly spinning him off his feet. But the cowboy's own marksmanship was deadly accurate, and his return fire took the outlaw leader in the heart. Black Jack Blackwood, the scourge of the Arizona Territory, fell face first into the dust he had spilled so much blood upon. His reign of terror was finally over. But the battle wasn't finished yet. Sidewinder Pete and Deadeye Davidson were still alive and dangerous, and they had no intention of surrendering to face territorial justice. "Pete," Davidson called from his sniper's position. "The horses, we can still make it out of here." The two surviving outlaws began a fighting retreat toward their mounts, which were tied up behind the mine shaft building. They fired as they moved, trying to keep their enemies pinned down while they escaped. Joseph, however, had anticipated this move. The Apache scout had circled around to the horse corral and was waiting in ambush. As Sidewinder Pete rounded the corner of the building at a run, he found himself face to face with a warrior whose ancestors had been fighting in this desert long before any white man had ever seen it. The confrontation was brief and decisive. Pete's rifle was designed for long-range shooting, not close-quarters combat, and Joseph's tomahawk ended the fight before it could properly begin. That left only Deadeye Davidson, still perched atop the mine shaft housing with his rifle. But his commanding position had become a trap, as there was no way down that wouldn't expose him to fire from below. "Give it up, Davidson," Dusty called out, reloading his pistols while keeping one eye on the sniper above. "Your boss is dead and your friends are gone. You've got nowhere to run." "Go to hell, cowboy," came the defiant reply, followed by another rifle shot that kicked up dust near Dusty's feet. But Davidson's defiance was born of desperation rather than confidence. He was alone, outgunned, and trapped in a position with no escape route. As the minutes passed, it became clear that his ammunition was running low, while his enemies seemed to have an endless supply. The end came suddenly and dramatically. As Davidson rose to take what he hoped would be a killing shot at Dusty, Elizabeth stepped out of the main building and fired the last bullet in her captured pistol. Her shot took the sniper in the chest, and he toppled from his perch to crash into the dust 30 feet below. The silence that followed was deafening after the thunderous noise of battle. Smoke drifted lazily from the barrels of discharged weapons, and the acrid smell of gunpowder hung in the desert air. But slowly, the natural sounds of the wilderness began to return, the call of a hawk circling overhead, the rustle of wind through the mesquite bushes, the distant howl of a coyote. Elizabeth dropped the empty pistol and ran across the courtyard to where Dusty stood swaying slightly, his left arm bloody but his spirit unbroken. She threw her arms around him, not caring about the dust, the blood, or the impropriety of such a public display of affection. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispered against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart through his sweat-stained shirt. "Not a chance," Dusty replied, wincing as he wrapped his good arm around her. "I made you a promise and I always keep my promises." Joseph emerged from behind the mine shaft building, wiping his knife clean on a piece of cloth. The Apache warrior's face showed no emotion, but his dark eyes held a satisfaction that spoke of justice finally served. "It is finished," he said simply. "The territory will be safer now." As the 3 survivors of the Battle of Skeleton Canyon tended their wounds and gathered the outlaws' weapons, none of them could have imagined how their story would grow in the telling. Years later, dime novelists would write lurid tales of the shootout, newspaper reporters would interview anyone who claimed to have been there, and storytellers around campfires would embellish the details until fact and legend became indistinguishable. But at that moment, as the desert sun climbed toward its zenith and the heat began to build toward another scorching afternoon, they were simply 3 people who had survived a deadly encounter through courage, skill, and an unshakable determination to protect what they held dear. The ride back to Mesquite Springs was a triumphant procession, though a somber one as well. They had won a great victory, but it had come at the cost of violence and death, even if that death had been visited upon those who richly deserved it. Elizabeth rode behind Dusty on Ranger, her arms wrapped around his waist, while Joseph led the string of captured horses that had belonged to the outlaw gang. The bodies they left behind would be buried by the territorial authorities, and their weapons and equipment would be sold to benefit the families of their victims. As they topped the rise overlooking Mesquite Springs, they could see the entire town waiting for them in the main street. News of the battle had somehow preceded them, perhaps carried by one of the Apache scouts who worked for the army, or simply by the mysterious telegraph system that seemed to operate in the desert through means no white man fully understood. The welcome they received was everything that heroes could have hoped for. Sheriff Bradley stepped forward to shake hands with each of them, his weathered face beaming with relief and pride. "The whole territory will sleep easier tonight," he said. "Black Jack Blackwood and his gang have been the scourge of honest folks for too long." Dr. Prescott hurried forward with his medical bag to tend to Dusty's wounded arm, while Martha Prescott embraced Elizabeth like a long-lost daughter. The other townspeople crowded around, everyone talking at once, eager to hear the details of the confrontation that had ended one of the most notorious outlaw careers in the Southwest. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when little Maria Santos, the miner's daughter, broke free from her parents and ran to Elizabeth. "Señorita," she cried, throwing her small arms around her teacher's waist. "We were so scared for you. But you were brave like you said." Elizabeth knelt down to hug the child, feeling tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed during the danger now flowing freely down her cheeks. "We were all brave today, sweetheart. That's what people do when they care about each other, they find courage they didn't know they had." 3 weeks later, as the autumn sun painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Mesquite Springs prepared for a celebration unlike any in its brief history. The defeat of the Blackwood gang had brought peace to the region, but more importantly to the residents of the small town, it had brought about a romance that seemed to capture the very spirit of the American frontier. The wedding of Elizabeth Hartwell and Jake "Dusty" Morrison was set for the first Saturday in October, and the entire town had thrown itself into preparations with the enthusiasm of people who had found something truly worth celebrating. Elizabeth stood in front of the mirror in Martha Prescott's bedroom, admiring the wedding dress that had been crafted by the combined efforts of every skilled seamstress in town. It was simpler than the elaborate gown she might have worn back in Boston, but it was perfect for a frontier bride, elegant white cotton with delicate lace trim, practical enough for the desert climate yet beautiful enough for the most important day of her life. "You look radiant, dear," Martha said, adjusting the short veil that had been Elizabeth's grandmother's. "I've never seen a bride more glowing with happiness." Through the window, Elizabeth could see the preparations taking place in the main street. Tables had been set up for the feast that would follow the ceremony, and lanterns were being hung from every available post and tree branch. The entire population of Mesquite Springs seemed to be involved in some aspect of the celebration. Mexican families had contributed their finest dishes, tamales, enchiladas, and sweet churros dusted with cinnamon and sugar. The Chinese community had prepared elaborate rice dishes and delicate pastries. Even the normally reserved Apache families from the nearby reservation had sent gifts and representatives to honor the couple who had brought peace to their region. "I never imagined my wedding would be like this," Elizabeth mused, watching children chase each other between the tables while their parents hung decorations and arranged flowers. Back in Boston, it would have been a formal affair in a grand cathedral, with hundreds of guests I barely knew. "And which would you prefer?" Martha asked with a knowing smile. Elizabeth turned from the window, her green eyes bright with certainty. "This," she said simply. "1,000 times this. These people have become my family in a way that all the social acquaintances in Boston never were." A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation, and Sheriff Bradley's voice called out, "Ladies? The groom is getting mighty anxious, and the preacher says he's ready to begin whenever you are." Elizabeth took one final look in the mirror, hardly recognizing herself as the same woman who had stepped off the stagecoach just a month earlier. That woman had been seeking adventure and purpose. This woman had found love, belonging, and a home in the vast wilderness of the American Southwest. The wedding ceremony took place in the town's small church, a simple adobe building that had been built by the combined labor of the entire community. Reverend Samuel Marcus, a Methodist minister who traveled a circuit that covered hundreds of miles, had arrived the day before specifically to perform the ceremony. As Elizabeth walked down the short aisle on the arm of Dr. Prescott, who had volunteered to give her away in the absence of her father, she saw the faces of all the people who had welcomed her into their community. There was Joseph Crowfeather, dressed in his finest buckskins and a shirt that was clearly new. There were the Mexican families from the south side of town, the Chinese merchants from Chinatown, the miners and cowboys and shopkeepers who made up the diverse population of Mesquite Springs. But most importantly, there was Dusty standing at the altar in a new black suit that made him look almost unfamiliar, until she saw his storm-gray eyes, which held all the love and devotion she could have hoped for. The ceremony itself was brief and simple, in keeping with frontier traditions. Reverend Marcus spoke about the challenges and rewards of building a life together in harsh country, about the importance of standing by each other through good times and bad. When it came time for the vows, both Elizabeth and Dusty spoke from the heart rather than reciting memorized words. "Elizabeth," Dusty said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes, "I promise to love you, protect you, and stand by you through whatever this land throws at us. You came here from a world I never knew existed, but you've become part of this place, part of me, in a way I never thought possible." Elizabeth's response brought tears to the eyes of many in the congregation. "Dusty, you've shown me what it means to be truly free, to make my own choices and follow my own heart. I promise to be your partner in all things, to help you build the life we both dream of in this beautiful, wild country we've both come to love." When Reverend Marcus pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared seemed to seal not just their individual fates, but the destiny of the town itself. Mesquite Springs had found its heart in the love story of the lady from Boston and the lonesome cowboy. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by every family in town, while a mariachi band alternated with a fiddle player to provide music for dancing. Elizabeth, who had never danced to anything more rustic than a waltz, found herself learning the steps of frontier reels and Mexican folk dances with equal enthusiasm. As the evening progressed, she found herself in conversation with Joseph Crowfeather, who had become not just Dusty's friend but hers as well. "You have brought much happiness to our friend," the Apache scout said in his careful English. "But more than that, you have brought peace to this place. The children in your school, they learn not just reading and numbers, but how to live together despite their differences." Elizabeth was touched by his words. In the weeks since the confrontation with the Blackwood gang, her school had become more than just a place of learning. It had become a symbol of the multicultural harmony that made Mesquite Springs unique among frontier settlements. "I've learned as much from them as they have from me," she replied. "Perhaps more." As the night deepened and the celebration began to wind down, Dusty and Elizabeth finally found themselves alone on the porch of their new home, a larger house that the townspeople had built for them as a wedding gift, complete with a white picket fence and a garden where Elizabeth could grow the vegetables and flowers she loved. No regrets about leaving Boston behind? Dusty asked, settling beside her on the porch swing he had built with his own hands. Elizabeth considered the question as she watched the stars wheeling overhead in the vast desert sky. In the distance, she could hear the howl of coyotes and the soft whisper of wind through the mesquite trees. It was a sound she had come to love, so different from the urban noise of her former life. "The only regret I have," she said finally, "is that it took me so long to find my way here. This is where I belong, Dusty. Not just with you, though that's the most important part, but in this place with these people, building something meaningful and lasting." 5 years after the wedding that had become legend throughout the Arizona Territory, Elizabeth Morrison stood in the doorway of the Mesquite Springs School, watching her students file out into the afternoon sunshine. The school had grown considerably since her first day as a teacher. There were now 43 children enrolled, ranging from 6-year-old Pedro Santos to 18-year-old Catherine Chin, who was preparing to take the territorial teacher's examination. The diversity that had initially challenged Elizabeth had become the school's greatest strength. Students routinely helped translate for their classmates, and many had become fluent in 3 or 4 languages. The Apache children taught desert survival skills during nature walks, while the Chinese students shared their knowledge of mathematics and astronomy. The Mexican children contributed their rich oral traditions, and the Anglo children brought their family stories of life in the eastern states. Most remarkably, several of Elizabeth's former students had gone on to higher education. Carlos Morales, the boy who had dreamed of becoming an engineer, was now studying at the Territorial University in Tucson. Maria Santos had indeed become a nurse and was working at the new hospital that had been built in Mesquite Springs. Tommy Chin had opened his own business, combining his family's traditional medicine knowledge with modern techniques he had learned through correspondence courses. As Elizabeth locked the schoolhouse door, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that dusty afternoon when she had first arrived on the stagecoach from Tucson. She was no longer the uncertain young woman seeking adventure and purpose. She had become a pillar of the community, respected and beloved by people from all walks of life. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention to the road, where she could see Dusty approaching on Ranger. At 33, her husband had fulfilled his dream of owning his own ranch, though it was smaller and more modest than the massive spreads owned by cattle barons. The Double M Ranch, as they called it, specialized in breeding horses adapted to desert conditions, and Dusty had gained a reputation throughout the Southwest for producing some of the finest mounts available. "How was school today?" he asked, dismounting to greet her with a kiss that still made her heart race after 5 years of marriage. "Wonderful as always," Elizabeth replied. Katie Chin received word that she passed her teacher's examination. She'll be taking over the school in Tucson Flats next month. They walked together toward their home, past the white picket fence that had become somewhat weathered but remained sturdy and well-maintained. The garden Elizabeth had planted was flourishing, providing vegetables for their table and flowers to brighten their modest but comfortable house. As they reached the front porch, a small figure burst out of the house and ran toward them with arms outstretched. 3-year-old Jonathan Morrison was a perfect blend of his parents, his father's gray eyes and sandy hair combined with his mother's quick wit and determination. "Papa! Mama!" he cried, launching himself into Dusty's arms. "I helped Abuela Martha make cookies today." Martha Prescott, who had become like a grandmother to the boy, appeared in the doorway with flour on her apron and a smile on her face. "He was quite the little helper," she said, "though I suspect he ate more cookie dough than made it into the oven." As evening settled over Mesquite Springs, the Morrison family gathered on their front porch to watch the sunset paint the desert in brilliant colors. It had become their favorite time of day, when they could reflect on their blessings and plan for the future. "I received a letter from my father today," Elizabeth said, producing an envelope from her pocket. "He's finally agreed to visit us next spring." Dusty raised an eyebrow in surprise. Jonathan Hartwell had never approved of his daughter's decision to marry a cowboy and settle in the frontier, though his opposition had softened somewhat after the birth of his grandson. "What changed his mind?" Dusty asked. "Apparently, he read an article in the Boston Herald about the success of our school," Elizabeth explained. "The reporter interviewed several of our former students who are now making names for themselves throughout the territory. Father was quite impressed by what we've accomplished here." The article had indeed created quite a stir back east, where the idea of a multicultural frontier school was both exotic and inspiring. Elizabeth had been invited to speak at education conferences, and several Eastern philanthropists had donated money to expand the school's programs. "I think he's beginning to understand that I didn't throw my life away when I came out here," Elizabeth continued. I found it. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, little Jonathan fell asleep in his father's arms, secure in the knowledge that he was loved and protected. Elizabeth watched her husband and son with a contentment she had never imagined possible during her restless years in Boston. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Black Jack Blackwood had never threatened the town? She asked softly. If you and I had simply met under normal circumstances? Dusty considered the question as he gently rocked their sleeping child. I think we would have found each other eventually, he said. Some things are just meant to be, and love like ours doesn't depend on dramatic circumstances. It depends on two people recognizing something special in each other and being brave enough to reach for it. Years later, when historians wrote about the settling of the American West, they would focus on the famous battles, the railroad construction, and the economic development that transformed a wilderness into a collection of thriving states. But in the small town of Mesquite Springs, Arizona, people remembered a different kind of history, the story of how love and courage had brought together a Boston lady and a lonesome cowboy, creating not just a family but a community that proved the American dream was big enough to include everyone willing to work for it. The schoolhouse still stands today, though it has been expanded several times to accommodate the growing student body. A bronze plaque beside the door reads, The Elizabeth Hartwell Morrison School, founded 1882, where children of all nations learn together. Inside, portraits of the school's first teacher and the cowboy who loved her hang in the place of honor, reminding each new generation of students that courage, love, and determination can overcome any obstacle. The desert wind still whispers through the mesquite trees, carrying with it the stories of those who dared to dream of a better life in the American West. And sometimes, if you listen carefully on a quiet evening when the coyotes sing their ancient songs, you can almost hear the echo of hoofbeats on dusty trails, the laughter of children learning their lessons, and the promise of two hearts that found each other in the vast wilderness of the frontier. The lady and the lonesome cowboy had become more than just husband and wife, they had become legend, their love story woven into the very fabric of the American West. And their legacy lived on, not in monuments of stone and steel, but in the lives they had touched, the students they had taught, and the community they had helped to build in the harsh but beautiful desert of Arizona territory. In the end, perhaps that is the greatest love story of all, not just the romance between two people, but the love they shared with an entire community, creating something lasting and beautiful in a land where only the strongest dreams survived. The desert had tested them, challenged them, and ultimately embraced them, making them part of its eternal story of hope, courage, and the unbreakable human spirit. And as the stars wheeled overhead in the vast western sky, the town of Mesquite Springs slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that some love stories are strong enough to last forever, becoming part of the very landscape they were born in, as eternal and enduring as the desert itself.